I went to the bank to close his account, and the manager looked at me the way people look at someone who has just misplaced their own name. His hands trembled slightly as he handed me the folder across the counter, his voice soft, cautious, the kind reserved for bad news and old age. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "there's something here that was left for you. A letter. He asked me to give it only to you." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him, because Richard was never the sort of man to write letters. He was the type who preferred silence to sentiment, who believed emotions should be managed like bills, paid promptly, filed away, and never discussed again. But there it was, a white envelope with my name written in his unmistakable hand, the same steady accountant's handwriting that had once labeled every drawer in our house. It was strange, seeing my name written that way again, as if he'd known I would come that morning, as if he'd been waiting even after death. I didn't open it right there. I simply held it, my fingers pressing into the paper like it might dissolve if I didn't hold tight enough. The manager offered his condolences, the rehearsed sort that sound almost kind, and asked whether I wanted to keep the account open. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Close it. There's nothing left." And he nodded, tapping at his keyboard, not realizing how right I was. I walked outside into the brittle morning air, holding the envelope against my chest as if it were something fragile and alive. The wind smelled faintly of rain and car exhaust, the kind of air that belongs to cities and endings. I sat on a bench near the parking lot and watched people move with purpose, their errands small and loud against the silence that followed me everywhere now. It had been 3 weeks since Richard died, 3 weeks of paperwork, polite condolences, casseroles I didn't eat, and phone calls I couldn't answer. Everyone said the same thing: "You must miss him terribly." And I would nod, because that was what they expected. But the truth was quieter, colder. I didn't miss him. I missed the idea of what we were supposed to be. After 54 years of marriage, what lingered wasn't love. It was the shape of routine, the absence of noise where his television used to hum. When people die, they leave spaces behind, not memories. And I had learned to live inside those spaces long before he went into the ground. The morning he died, I was in the kitchen, washing the same mug he always used, the one with the faded university crest. The phone rang once, then twice, and when I heard the nurse's voice say the word "gone," I didn't cry. I felt something lift off me, something that had sat on my chest for decades. But then the guilt came, heavy and thick, as if I'd committed a betrayal just by breathing easier. I'd spent my whole life believing grief was proof of love. What no one tells you is that sometimes grief is just habit, something you wear because people expect you to. I dressed in black. I nodded through the service. I accepted his folded flag, even though he'd never believed in symbols. Then I came home to an empty house that didn't smell like him anymore, just dust and old paper. And I told myself I was free. Freedom, however, is never as clean as people imagine. It comes with echoes, voices you thought you'd silenced. Richard's will was simple enough. The lawyer said everything had been arranged months before, in perfect order, efficient, predictable. But there were omissions I couldn't ignore. Certain accounts that had once been joint had disappeared from the documents. My son, Peter, said it was nothing, that the lawyers knew best. He had always spoken to me the way one speaks to a child holding scissors, careful, patient, condescending. "You don't need to worry about all that, Mom," he said after the funeral. "Dad and I sorted everything. Dad and I." Those 3 words had been the soundtrack of my life. The secret alliance between father and son that left no room for me except as a provider of meals, checks, and approval. So that morning when I went to the bank, it wasn't just to close an account. It was to touch the last physical piece of him, to prove that something still had my name on it. The bank was the same one we'd used for 40 years, though it looked unrecognizable now, sterile, all glass and screens. I remembered when they used to know your name at the counter, when a teller would ask about your family instead of scanning your ID like a barcode. I'd stood at that same counter decades earlier, pregnant and hopeful, depositing the first payment for the house we thought would make us safe forever. The same counter where Richard once told me, "You're better with numbers than I am," though he still insisted on managing all our accounts. He liked the feeling of control, the illusion of competence. I let him have it because marriage teaches you which battles are worth the noise. When the manager handed me the envelope, I thought maybe it was a receipt, a routine formality, but my name, written in that careful hand, undid something in me. I slipped it into my purse and walked to the park down the street, the same one where Richard used to feed the pigeons while pretending not to. He'd called it wasting bread, but he went every Sunday all the same. I sat on the bench we used to share and ran my thumb over the envelope's edge. My hands looked older than I remembered. There were days when I caught my reflection and saw not myself, but my mother, the same trembling veins, the same quiet endurance. I wondered what she would say if she were here. Probably something simple like, "Read it or burn it, but don't carry it unopened." She'd never believed in lingering. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I thought of all the letters I had never received, the apologies that never came, the explanations buried under the polite silence of a long marriage. Richard had been faithful in every way except the emotional one. He was loyal to his own fears, devoted to appearances, allergic to confrontation. We built our life around avoidance. He built walls of routine and called it devotion. I built bridges of forgiveness and called it love. And now all that remained was an envelope that might contain the first true thing he'd ever said to me. The park was nearly empty, except for a man walking a dog that looked too old to care about anything. The sky was dull gray, the kind that presses low against the ground. I thought about how strange it was that the world keeps moving, even when your own has stopped. People still mail packages, still argue about traffic, still check their phones while you're sitting there holding a letter that might rearrange your entire past. I slid a finger under the flap and felt the resistance of paper that hadn't been touched in weeks. The seal broke with a sigh. Inside, just a single sheet, folded twice. No date, no greeting, just my name at the top and the first line written in his usual precision. If you are reading this, it means I finally ran out of time to make things right. I read that line over and over, my heart stubbornly refusing to quicken. He wrote that he was sorry, not for dying, but for what he had allowed to happen while he was alive, that he had trusted Peter too much, signed too many papers without understanding, believed too many reassurances, that there was money missing, a small fortune meant for my retirement, now vanished into investments he hadn't dared to question. And then the line that stopped me. If you ever want to know where it went, go to the Oakside branch, safe deposit box 112. It's all there, and I'm sorry I didn't stop him. The words blurred for a moment, not because I cried, but because something in my mind went utterly still. He hadn't written to comfort me. He had written to confess, to shift the weight of his silence onto me. For a long time I sat there, the letter trembling between my fingers, the wind tugging at its edges like it wanted to take it. Cars passed, children laughed in the distance, and the world remained perfectly indifferent. I thought about going home, making tea, pretending this had never happened. But I couldn't unsee his handwriting, the ink pressed too hard as if he'd been shaking. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. my decision already forming like a storm at the edge of consciousness. I would go to Oakside. I would see for myself what he'd left behind. For once, I would stop being the woman who believed that not knowing was safer. As I stood to leave, I noticed something strange. On the bottom of the page, beneath his signature, a faint line in smaller writing, almost an afterthought. Tell no one, especially Peter. The ink was faded, like he'd added it later, perhaps after realizing how much his son had already taken. I slipped the letter back into my purse, feeling its weight against my side like a second heartbeat. I didn't know what I was walking toward, only that I couldn't stay in the familiar ruins any longer. The letter had done what years of silence never could. It had opened a door, and though part of me wanted to lock it again, another part, the one that had been waiting all my life to be seen, was already stepping through. That was the day everything began to shift, quietly, invisibly, like ice breaking beneath the surface of a frozen river. I left the park, crossed the street, and looked back only once at the bank's glass facade reflecting the sky. My reflection in it looked smaller than I remembered, but sharper too, like a photograph coming into focus after years in the dark. Whatever waited inside that deposit box, it was mine to face. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, the thought of facing something didn't make me afraid. It made me feel alive. I took the train to Oakside the following Tuesday, though to anyone else it might have looked like an errand. An elderly woman on her way to deposit a check or pay a bill, wrapped in her old navy coat and holding a purse large enough to hide her trembling hands. I did not tell Peter I was leaving town, nor did I tell the neighbors who occasionally brought soup, as if widowhood were a kind of prolonged flu. I simply left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Gone for the day," because explanations had become too heavy to carry. The ride to Oakside was quiet and mechanical, the rhythm of the train clicking through my thoughts like a metronome keeping time with the past. I watched the fields blur into strips of dull green, then into the outskirts of the city, where everything smelled faintly of rain and gasoline. The letter sat in my bag, folded so many times its edges were beginning to soften. Every so often I touched it to make sure it was still there, like a talisman or a wound that hadn't finished bleeding. The Oakside branch was smaller than I remembered, one of those old-fashioned banks that hadn't yet surrendered entirely to automation. It stood between a pharmacy and a bakery that smelled of sugar and burnt coffee, its brick facade faded to the color of dust. The glass doors were spotless, too clean for a place that handled other people's desperation. When I stepped inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic, carrying the scent of paper, ink, and something sterile. I told the woman at the reception desk my name, explained that my late husband had a safe deposit box registered under his account. She looked at me with the blank politeness of someone whose job requires compassion but forbids involvement. "Do you have identification?" she asked. I handed her my ID, my hands shaking slightly. She typed something into her computer, frowned, and then disappeared behind a frosted glass partition. For a moment, I stood alone in the lobby, surrounded by the soft murmur of printers and the polite laughter of people pretending money doesn't define them. I thought about how many years Richard had spent in rooms like this, signing papers, nodding at men in ties, believing that order was the same thing as virtue. The receptionist returned with a man in a gray suit, whose expression hovered somewhere between curiosity and caution. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, extending his hand. "I'm the branch manager. My condolences on your loss. I understand you're here about safe deposit box 112. His tone was even, professional, but something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. "Yes," I said. "My husband left me instructions to retrieve it." He nodded slowly, almost gravely, and gestured for me to follow him. We walked down a long, narrow corridor lined with muted paintings of landscapes no one had ever visited. The floor was tiled in beige marble, the kind that makes every footstep sound like a confession. At the end of the hall stood a heavy steel door. He turned a key, entered a code, and the mechanism released with a sound that was half sigh, half accusation. Inside, the vault smelled faintly of oil and damp paper. The walls were lined with hundreds of small boxes, each one a silent container of someone's secrets, someone's insurance against the world's unpredictability. "Here it is," he said, pointing to a small metal drawer halfway up the wall. "Box 112. He inserted the key, turned it with deliberate care, and pulled it free. "Would you like some privacy?" I nodded. He left, closing the door softly behind him, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly alone. Not the domestic kind of aloneness that follows after death, but the raw kind, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I slid the box out and set it on the small table in the center of the room. My fingers hesitated over the lid. I half expected nothing but dust, perhaps an old photograph or a few sentimental trinkets. Instead, when I opened it, I saw order, neat stacks of paper, an envelope, a small flash drive wrapped in tissue, and a yellowed note clipped to the top. The handwriting was not Richard's. It was sharp, angular, almost hurried. It read, "Mr. Harrow, as discussed, I strongly advise against finalizing these transfers without your spouse's written consent. These transactions may expose you to legal complications. Please reconsider." It was signed by a name I didn't recognize, a former bank employee, perhaps. Beneath the note were printed statements, account records from 3 years earlier, showing large sums withdrawn from our joint savings and transferred into an account under Peter's name. The amounts were staggering, impossible to mistake for ordinary expenses. Each line item was a small act of erasure, a quiet betrayal executed in the language of decimals and signatures. My hands began to shake, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was rage or disbelief. I searched the box again, half hoping there had been some mistake, that the name on the account would belong to someone else, but it didn't. It was Peter's, written clearly, confidently, as if entitlement were a hereditary right. I unfolded the second letter, this one in Richard's familiar handwriting, smaller and more deliberate than the first. I didn't know how to stop him. It began. He said it was temporary, that he was helping us with the taxes, that it was safer this way. I wanted to believe him. I let him talk me into it, and then it was done. I kept waiting for the right moment to tell you, but shame grows fast. I thought if I ignored it, it might die on its own. I was wrong. By the time I realized how much he had taken, I was too sick to fix it. I can't undo it now, but you can. The proof is here. Do what I didn't have the courage to do. The words blurred as I read them, not because of tears, but because my mind refused to hold them all at once. It was as though the foundation of every quiet compromise, every swallowed protest, every obedient silence had cracked open at once, revealing the rot beneath. I thought of Peter as a boy, the way he used to hide behind my legs when strangers spoke to him, the way he once cried because a classmate called him selfish. I had spent years reassuring him that he was kind, that he was good, that the world would see it one day. And now, here it was, the world seeing him exactly as he was, and I was the one who hadn't looked. I sat there for what must have been an hour, reading and rereading the evidence of my own blindness. At some point, the manager knocked gently on the door to ask if I needed more time. I told him yes, though what I really needed was another life. When I finally stepped out, Carrying the papers and the flash drive in my purse, he looked at me with the faint, helpless pity of someone who has seen too many versions of the same story. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. "I will be," I said, though the words felt like someone else's. Outside, the light had changed. The sky was bruised with clouds, the kind that promise rain without mercy. I walked slowly toward the train station, each step heavier than the last. The wind tugged at my coat, and I realized how small I must look. An old woman clutching a bag of documents that no one else would ever care about. But inside that bag was proof that I had been right to feel the unease I could never name, proof that love can curdle into convenience, that family can become the most polite form of theft. At the station, I sat on a wooden bench, opened the folder again, and stared at the signatures. His, mine, Peter's, all in a row, each stroke of ink a small surrender. How many times had I told myself that trust was the same as faith? How many times had I chosen silence because confrontation felt like ingratitude? The train arrived with a metallic groan, scattering the pigeons on the platform. I boarded without looking back, the folder pressed tightly to my chest. As the train lurched forward, I watched the town slide away, the buildings shrinking into distance like the pieces of a puzzle I no longer wished to complete. The passengers around me were busy with their phones, their conversations, their distractions. I sat perfectly still, the rhythm of the tracks beating like a slow, deliberate countdown. I thought of Richard, of the way he used to hum under his breath when he was nervous, of how that hum had filled our house even in silence. I wondered if he'd written the first letter in guilt or desperation, if he had known what it would do to me. And then I realized it didn't matter. The truth is never a gift. It's a debt being collected long after you've forgotten the loan. When the train pulled into my stop, I didn't move right away. I sat there, watching the doors open and close, the world continuing as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. I felt something inside me harden, not into anger exactly, but into a kind of resolve I hadn't known I was capable of. I stepped off the train and walked home through the drizzle, my shoes soaking through, my coat clinging to my shoulders. The letter in my purse rustled with each movement, a paper heartbeat keeping time with the one inside my chest. I no longer felt old. I no longer felt like someone waiting to be told what was hers. For the first time in my life, I felt dangerous. Not because I had power, but because I had nothing left to lose. By the time I reached my street, the rain had turned steady, soaking the sidewalks and blurring the lights into watery halos. I unlocked the door to my house and stood in the entryway, dripping onto the rug we'd bought together half a lifetime ago. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the scent of a life too long preserved. I placed the papers on the kitchen table, smoothed them out, and whispered to the empty room, "You should have told me sooner, Richard." My voice sounded strange, firmer than I expected. Then I added, quieter still, "But I'm listening now." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off, as if the world itself had finally decided to answer. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that what I had discovered could still be contained, that the past could be folded back into the neat shape of routine if only I ignored it long enough. But the lie of calm never lasts, not when you've seen the proof of betrayal printed in ink that will outlive you. The folder stayed on the kitchen table, a quiet accusation, and I began to move around it like one circles a sleeping animal, afraid to wake it, but unable to look away. I told myself that I would deal with it later, after I'd gathered more strength, after I'd had another night of decent sleep, after I'd stopped feeling like every breath was being measured against what had been stolen. But each morning I woke earlier. unable to shake the image of Peter's signature, the confident slope of his name on papers I had never been allowed to read. I found myself remembering the years when he still laughed easily, when his voice carried warmth instead of calculation. I remembered the first time he'd asked for money, the way he had looked at me, not as a son asking for help, but as a man claiming what he believed to be his inheritance. That, I realized, had been the beginning of my erasure. The rest had only been paperwork. I tried to call him once, that first Sunday after Oakside. He answered on the third ring, his tone brisk, efficient, as if he were between meetings. "Mom, everything okay?" I hesitated, my throat tightening around the words I couldn't quite release. I wanted to tell him that I knew, that the years of quiet dependency were over, that I had finally opened my eyes. But I heard something in his voice, a hint of suspicion, a faint impatience, and I lost my nerve. "Just checking in," I said, and hated myself for how small I sounded. He exhaled, not quite sighing, just a controlled release of air. "I'm glad you're keeping busy," he said. "Listen, I've got a call in a minute. We'll talk soon, okay?" It wasn't a question. I said yes, and hung up before my voice could betray me. Afterward, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone, the silence thick and absolute. There had been a time when his words filled me with pride, when his success had felt like the only proof that my sacrifices had meant something. Now they just sounded like dismissal wrapped in courtesy. By Monday, I couldn't stand the house. Every object seemed to hum with memory. The chair he used to sit in when he visited, the framed photo of his children smiling with a kind of practiced ease, the faint ring on the countertop where Richard's coffee mug used to sit each morning. I went through drawers I hadn't opened in years, as if order might substitute for peace. In the back of one, I found a stack of old bank statements, some dating back nearly 20 years. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the numbers still carried their quiet authority. Line by line, they told a story of slow disappearance, accounts merged, names removed, balances shifting just slightly enough each year that I hadn't noticed. I traced the pattern until my eyes blurred, and then I saw it. The year when Richard retired, the same year Peter began managing his own firm. That was when the transfers had begun, small at first, then larger, steady, confident. He must have assured his father that it was all part of a plan, a consolidation, a tax strategy. Richard had always been easy to persuade when flattery was involved. All Peter had to do was call him wise, call him practical, and he would sign anything placed in front of him. That afternoon, I walked to the local library, a habit I'd kept from the years before everything began to shrink. The librarian, a woman with silver hair and a voice like warm milk, smiled when she saw me. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mrs. Harrow." I returned her smile, though it felt stiff. "I've been busy," I said, which was true in the way grief is busy. It fills every hour with motion, but never meaning. I asked for books about estate law, about elder rights, about the ways money can move without permission. She looked at me curiously, as if trying to decide whether I was researching or confessing. "Light reading," she said, handing over a stack. "Be careful. Those pages can start arguments." I thanked her and carried the books home, their weight both comforting and unbearable. That night, I read until my eyes stung, piecing together the invisible scaffolding of deceit, every clause, every signature space, every polite phrase designed to disguise ownership. It was all there in black and white, the ease with which a life can be rewritten when trust is mistaken for love. Sleep became a stranger after that. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the papers spread out like a map of a place I no longer wanted to return to. Sometimes I would imagine confronting him, rehearsing the words I would finally say. In those fantasies, he always looked startled at first, then guilty, then, worst of all, calm. I could almost hear him explaining, reasonable as ever. "Mom, you don't understand how things work now. It was just easier this way." Easier. The word echoed until it felt like a physical bruise. How many choices in my life had been made in the name of ease? How many times had I kept quiet because the noise of truth seemed impolite? I had spent decades being agreeable, and this was where it had led me, alone, deceived, and too old to start over. Yet something in me resisted that last thought. Maybe starting over didn't mean beginning from youth. Maybe it meant beginning from honesty, even if the only one listening was yourself. 2 days later, a letter arrived in the mail, postmarked from the city where Peter lived. The envelope was expensive, thick, his company's logo embossed in the corner. Inside, a typed note. "Mom, I wanted to check on you. I've been meaning to stop by, but things have been hectic at work. Let me know if you need anything. Groceries, maintenance around the house, whatever. I can transfer some money if that helps. Love, Peter." There was no mention of Richard, no mention of Oakside, nothing that acknowledged the quiet storm brewing between us. It was the kind of letter you send when you want to appear attentive without actually engaging. I stared at it for a long time before realizing it wasn't concern. It was surveillance. He was testing the ground, sensing that something had shifted. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the same folder as the bank records. The page crackled softly, like dry leaves underfoot. In the following week, my world shrank and expanded in the same breath. I began walking every morning, long routes through the neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years, but never truly seen. The houses looked different now, each one a small fortress of private stories, each curtain a veil for secrets that probably resembled my own. I stopped at the park sometimes, the same bench where I had read Richard's first letter. The pigeons gathered as if on cue, pecking at invisible crumbs, and I envied their simplicity, their hunger unburdened by memory. I would sit for an hour, breathing in the damp air, thinking about the strange alchemy of betrayal, how it doesn't just take away trust, it rearranges time itself. You start remembering differently. You start realizing that moments you thought were loving were actually transactional, that every act of kindness had an invoice attached. One morning I woke with a decision already forming, quiet but absolute. I would go back to the bank. Not Oakside this time, but the branch where Peter had first persuaded Richard to sign those documents. I would ask for copies, statements, anything they could give me. I dressed carefully, choosing the gray wool skirt and the brooch Richard's mother had given me years ago, a small shield of respectability. At the counter, the young clerk blinked when I made my request. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "Those accounts were closed years ago. I can't access that information without authorization." "Authorization from whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, lowering her voice. "From your son, Mrs. Harrow. He's listed as the primary on those accounts." I thanked her, smiled politely, and left before she could see how much effort it took to stay upright. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright, almost accusatory. My hands trembled as I reached for the railing, gripping it until the dizziness passed. So that was it, legally invisible, erased by the signatures of the two men I had trusted most. That afternoon, I called the legal aid office, listed in one of the books I'd borrowed. The woman who answered sounded tired, but kind, her voice seasoned by years of listening to stories like mine. "Financial exploitation by family members is more common than people think," she said after I explained. Do you have documentation? I have everything, I replied. She told me to bring it in, to schedule an appointment, to prepare myself for patience. These things take time, she warned. I almost laughed at that. Time was the only thing I had left. That night, as rain tapped softly against the window, I took out Richard's second letter and read it again. The ink had begun to fade slightly where my fingers had touched it too often. He had written about his fear, about how the truth had grown heavier each year until he could barely breathe. For the first time, I understood that fear, not as weakness, but as inheritance. We had both lived lives shaped by avoidance, afraid to disturb the delicate balance of appearances. But appearances were all that remained now, and they had no power left over me. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered into the dim kitchen, "It's time." The next morning, I woke early, before dawn, the air still thick with the smell of rain. I made coffee, the kind Richard used to claim was too strong, and sat by the window watching the light creep across the floor. For years I had lived waiting for someone to tell me what to do, husband, son, banker, lawyer. But that morning I realized I no longer needed permission. I didn't yet know what justice would look like for a woman like me, small and easily dismissed, but I knew where to begin. Somewhere between the sound of the kettle and the taste of the bitter coffee, I decided that silence would no longer be my language. When the first light finally reached the corner of the table, it fell across the folder, illuminating the papers like relics. I touched the edge of the top page, tracing the familiar loops of Peter's signature. My hand didn't tremble this time. The fear had receded, replaced by something quieter, sharper, clarity. The years of obedience had been a kind of sleep, but the letter, the box, the evidence, they had been my alarm. I was awake now, and there would be no going back to the comfort of ignorance. Outside, a bird began to sing, one of those rough, persistent morning calls that refuses to be ignored. It sounded almost like defiance, and I found myself smiling, not out of joy, but recognition. After all, I thought, defiance runs in the blood. I took the folder with me to the legal aid office on a gray Thursday morning that smelled of damp asphalt and exhaustion. The building was old, a former post office converted into something vaguely bureaucratic and charitable, with flickering fluorescent lights and the faint odor of disinfectant. At the reception desk sat a young woman in a cardigan that swallowed her frame. She looked up with the polite weariness of someone who had already heard too many stories before noon. I told her my name, my purpose, and she handed me a clipboard stacked with forms. The words blurred slightly as I filled them out. Alleged financial exploitation, suspected misuse of power of attorney, primary perpetrator, family member. Phrases that turned private shame into administrative language. When I finished, I sat in the waiting area beneath a poster that read, "Know Your Rights," in cheerful blue letters, and wondered how many people sitting in those same plastic chairs had once believed, as I had, that family was a form of protection. A woman called my name eventually, a middle-aged lawyer named Daria, who wore no makeup and spoke with the unhurried precision of someone who has seen the entire spectrum of human betrayal and no longer flinches. She led me into a small office cluttered with file boxes and wilted plants. "Tell me everything," she said, her pen already poised. I began at the beginning. Richard's letter, the Oakside deposit box, the transfers, the signatures. I told her about Peter's charm, his steady transformation from grateful son to distant benefactor, the way he had started to speak to me in sentences that sounded like invoices. As I spoke, I realized how little of my own voice I had used in the past decade. I had been reduced to polite responses, nods, and the small talk of survival. Daria listened without interruption, her expression shifting only once, when I mentioned the manager's note advising Richard not to proceed. "That's crucial," she said. "It proves awareness. It means your husband knew it was questionable." She asked if I still had the originals. I handed them to her carefully, the papers trembling slightly in my grasp. She spread them across her desk like a map and studied each one with reverent concentration. "We can build a case," she said finally, "but it will take time. He'll deny everything. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at her and felt something unexpected, relief. "I've been denied all my life," I said. "This time I'll be ready." On the bus ride home, the city passed by in slow, fractured reflections against the rain-streaked windows. Every building seemed to mirror something back at me. The law office, the bank, the apartment blocks filled with people nursing their own quiet humiliations. I thought of all the women I had known, neighbors, friends, distant relatives, who had built their lives around men and sons who saw gratitude as obedience. We had been raised to endure, to stretch our patience until it became a form of virtue. No one had ever taught us that endurance could also be complicity. When I stepped off the bus, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick and metallic, like a storm waiting for a signal. I carried the folder close to my chest and walked slowly, letting the rhythm of my steps settle my thoughts. By the time I reached home, I knew that the next move would have to come from me. The following week was a blur of small, deliberate actions. I bought a new notebook, the kind with thick paper that doesn't bleed, and began writing everything down. Dates, amounts, names, memories that might one day serve as evidence. I found an old portable recorder in the drawer where Richard used to keep batteries and began recording my recollections in the evenings. My voice on playback sounded older than I expected, steadier too, as if the act of speaking aloud had hardened something inside me. Daria called to say she had spoken to the bank's legal department and confirmed the timeline. The transactions had been structured carefully, layered to look legitimate. "Your son knew exactly what he was doing," she said. I thanked her and hung up, and for the first time I said the words aloud to an empty room. "My son stole from me." They felt heavy in my mouth, foreign, like a sentence in another language that I had only just learned to pronounce. At night, I found myself dreaming of houses, endless corridors filled with locked doors, rooms that changed shape when I turned my back. Sometimes Richard appeared in those dreams, sitting at a desk signing forms while I stood at the window, watching rain leak through the ceiling. He never looked up. I would wake with the taste of paper in my mouth, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress. I started sleeping with the lamp on, as if the light could keep the past from rearranging itself while I rested. One afternoon, I went to the market and ran into a woman I hadn't seen in years, Helen, a former neighbor from the old street where Peter had grown up. She was the kind of woman who remembered every detail of every family's downfall, her curiosity disguised as concern. "I heard about Richard," she said, touching my arm. "You must be lonely. Does Peter visit much?" The question, innocent to anyone else, landed like a blade. "Not often," I said. She nodded sympathetically. Such a shame. He was such a devoted boy, always helping his father with the bills. I smiled thinly and said nothing. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time before going inside. That was how it had looked from the outside all along. My son, the dutiful helper, the responsible man. I had been the quiet background to his performance, the mother who never asked questions. The realization didn't sting, it clarified. Appearances had always been his camouflage. In the evenings, I began sorting through old photographs. Most were of birthdays and holidays, moments meant to prove affection. Yet in every picture, I noticed the same thing. My posture slightly angled away, Richard looking elsewhere, Peter centered in the frame. It was as if I had always known where I stood, just outside the circle of importance. I tore a few photos in half without quite knowing why, then stopped, ashamed of the impulse but unwilling to regret it. Daria had told me that anger was a necessary part of reclaiming power. It's not destruction, she said. It's recognition. As the weeks passed, small coincidences began to feel deliberate. One morning, I found my mailbox open with nothing inside, though I had locked it the night before. Another day, the phone rang once and stopped, the caller ID showing Peter's office number. I began to suspect that he knew. Perhaps the bank had contacted him. Perhaps he had sensed my withdrawal, the shift in our balance. I started leaving the lights on in the hallway at night, not from fear, but from vigilance. You cannot unlearn vigilance once it has entered your blood. Then, without warning, a new letter arrived, not typed this time, but handwritten in a script I didn't recognize. Inside was a single line. Be careful what you open. Some boxes stay closed for a reason. No signature, no return address. My first instinct was disbelief, then anger, then something quieter, a cold understanding that I was being warned, not advised. I folded the note carefully and placed it in the folder with the rest. It changed nothing, but it confirmed what I already knew. He was aware of my awakening, and he was afraid of what I might do. Instead of shrinking, I felt myself expand in ways I couldn't have predicted. I began volunteering twice a week at the community center near the library, organizing books, answering phones, small tasks that made the hours bearable. There I met people who spoke openly about their losses, their bankruptcies, their children who had stopped calling. Their pain was ordinary, but it was also communal, shared without shame. For the first time in years, I felt less alone in my disillusionment. There was one woman in particular, Margaret, a retired nurse with a face carved by laughter and grief in equal measure. She told me that after her husband died, her own son sold her house without her consent. I sued him, she said matter-of-factly. Didn't get much back, but I got my name clean. She looked at me over her cup of tea and smiled. You'd be surprised what people like us can survive. I believed her. In early spring, Daria called again. She had filed the preliminary complaint, the first official step. It's public record now, she said. He'll be notified soon. I thanked her, hung up, and sat perfectly still, waiting for fear to arrive. But it didn't. What I felt instead was a strange calm, as if the current I'd been resisting had finally begun to carry me forward. I went to the park that afternoon, the same bench, the same pigeons, and for the first time since Richard's death, I breathed without heaviness. The wind had changed. It smelled faintly of earth, of something thawing. That night I stood by the window watching the city lights pulse in the distance. I realized that I had stopped waiting for apologies, for explanations, for the impossible restoration of innocence. Something had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the woman who moved through life apologizing for her own endurance. I was someone else now, someone capable of seeing the world as it was, not as it was promised. The paperwork was still in motion, the outcome uncertain, but the act itself had transformed me. It was no longer about money or justice in the legal sense. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own story. For decades, my life had been narrated by others, by a husband who mistook control for care, by a son who mistook entitlement for love. But now, standing in that dim kitchen, With the documents spread before me like constellations, I understood that every act of erasure can be answered by an act of naming. I said my own name aloud, slowly, deliberately, as if reintroducing myself to the woman who had been waiting all these years in silence. And for the first time in a long, long while, the echo that came back didn't sound lonely. It sounded whole. The letter of notification reached him faster than I had expected. I knew it the moment the phone began to ring, not in the hesitant rhythm of casual conversation, but with the persistent authority of confrontation. It was late afternoon, the light already turning that weak, diluted shade that makes everything appear more fragile than it is. I hesitated before answering, my hand hovering above the receiver like a child waiting for permission. When I finally picked up, his voice arrived sharp, polished, and edged with restrained panic. "Mom, what is this? I got a letter today from some legal office saying you filed a complaint against me. Tell me this is a mistake." For a long second, I couldn't speak. I listened to the sound of my own breathing in the silence between us, the pulse that had carried me through births, deaths, and quiet humiliations. Then I said very softly, "It's not a mistake, Peter." He exhaled a short, bitter laugh, the kind that used to charm clients and unsettle adversaries. "Do you even know what you're doing? Do you have any idea what this could cause? This isn't just embarrassing, it's destructive." I wanted to tell him that destruction had already happened, that I had lived inside its ruins for years, but the words caught somewhere behind my teeth. Instead, I said, "You took what wasn't yours. I have proof." For a moment he was silent, and in that silence I heard the faint tremor of something breaking, maybe pride, maybe calculation. Then he said, "You're confused. Dad and I managed those accounts together. Everything was transparent." I showed him every document. I closed my eyes and let the weight of his voice settle over me, a familiar net woven from certainty and contempt. "You showed him," I repeated, "but never me." He laughed again, louder this time. "You never wanted to deal with any of that. You always said numbers gave you headaches." I remembered that day clearly, the one he was referring to, the afternoon he had explained some investment to me in a tone so patient it was almost mocking. I had agreed just to end the conversation, had nodded like a fool because peace had seemed more precious than pride. "Maybe I lied," I said finally. "Maybe I was trying to make things easier for everyone. But I'm done being easy." He said my name then, not Mom, but Margaret, as if invoking some legal boundary between us. "Do you really want this to go public?" he asked. "Do you want people to know that you're accusing your own son of theft? Because once this starts, there's no going back." His voice softened, sliding into persuasion, that old rehearsed tenderness that used to melt my anger. "I can fix this quietly. I'll transfer the money back, all of it, with interest. We'll close the accounts and no one has to know." For a moment, I felt the old reflex stir, the temptation to retreat, to let him rewrite the story in gentler terms. But the part of me that had survived years of quiet compliance refused to yield. "You can't fix it," I said. "You can only confess it." His silence this time was colder, calculated. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said finally, and hung up. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with the phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the branches against the windows like impatient fingers. I thought of all the storms I had weathered without sound, how many tempests had passed through my home while I'd sat in the center pretending the walls were strong enough to hold. But this time, the storm was mine to summon. I called Daria the next morning and told her what had happened. She listened without interruption, then said, "Good. It means he's scared. Keep every record of contact, calls, letters, messages. From now on, everything he says can serve as proof of pressure or intimidation. The word intimidation sounded almost theatrical when applied to my life, but I knew what she meant. Power rarely announces itself. It seeps in, dressed as reason. 2 days later, a black car appeared at the end of my driveway, idling with its engine running. It was an unfamiliar model, sleek, the kind Peter drove for work. I watched from behind the curtain as a man stepped out, tall in a gray suit that looked expensive in a deliberately understated way. He walked up to the door and knocked twice. When I opened it, he smiled, revealing perfect, symmetrical teeth. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "I represent your son. He asked me to deliver this." He handed me an envelope, heavy with legal paper. His cologne lingered faintly, something metallic and cold. "I'd advise you to review it carefully before proceeding further. Litigation can become unpleasant." I thanked him, closed the door, and locked it. My hand shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter, formal, precise, dripping with intimidation, masked as professionalism. It accused me of defamation, emotional instability, and misinterpretation of financial arrangements. At the bottom, in a signature that was not his, but might as well have been, the threat was clear: withdrawal or counteraction. I laughed. Not loudly, but deeply, the sound surprising me. They thought I would frighten easily, that I would retreat into guilt. But guilt had already burned itself out years ago. I took the letter to Daria, who read it and raised one eyebrow. "Classic tactic," she said. "They want you to feel cornered. Don't respond directly. Let us handle it. The more noise he makes, the more he reveals." She leaned back in her chair and studied me. "Are you sleeping?" I nodded, though it wasn't true. Sleep had become a rehearsal for death, and I was not ready for that yet. I was still too angry, too alive. She smiled faintly. "Good," she said. "Anger is useful." The following weeks passed like a long exhalation. The investigation required patience, collecting records, verifying signatures, waiting for correspondence from the bank's compliance department. Each envelope that arrived felt like a pulse. Each page, another layer peeled back from years of denial. I began to keep the papers organized in neat binders, labeled with dates and subjects, my handwriting steady and deliberate. It felt almost sacred, the act of bringing order to chaos. I would sit at the table each morning, the documents spread before me, and whisper, "This is what truth looks like on paper." Then one evening, near the end of April, he appeared in person. I was in the garden, trimming the overgrown rose bushes that Richard had once tended, when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I turned and saw Peter standing by the car, hands in pockets, his expression controlled, but his posture betraying agitation. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the fading daylight. It struck me that I hadn't seen him up close since the funeral. Time had sharpened him, the neat haircut, the subtle arrogance of success, the faint lines around his mouth that came not from laughter, but restraint. "You could have called," I said, setting down the shears. He gave a small, humorless smile. "I figured this would be better face to face." He walked toward me, stopping just short of the porch. "Mom, please, let's talk like adults. You don't have to do this." His voice softened, almost pleading. "I can make this right." I crossed my arms. "Can you?" I asked. "Or do you just want to make it disappear?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the same nervous gesture he'd had as a boy when he was caught lying. "You're being manipulated," he said finally. "That lawyer, she's feeding you paranoia. There's no case. Everything I did was for you and Dad." "Don't bring him into this," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "He's done enough pretending." Peter stepped closer, lowering his tone. "You don't understand how this looks. You're going to ruin both our names. People will think you've lost control." I laughed then, a sound that startled even me. "My name has been ruined quietly for years," I said. "You just preferred it that way." His expression flickered. Anger, confusion, something close to pity. "I'm trying to protect you," he said, "from yourself." The arrogance of it struck me like a slap, but I stayed still. "If you were protecting me," I said, "you wouldn't have to hide the receipts." For a moment, I saw something raw in his face, a flicker of the child he once was, frightened and cornered. Then it vanished, replaced by coldness. "You're making a mistake," he said, stepping back. "This will end badly for you." I met his gaze and said, "Maybe, but it will end honestly." He left without another word, his car disappearing down the street in a streak of headlights. I stood there until the darkness swallowed the road, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the strange exhilaration of confrontation. For years I had dreamed of speaking a truth that would make him pause, even for a second, and now I had done it. It hadn't healed anything, but it had cracked the silence wide open. The next day, I found a small envelope pushed through the mail slot. Inside was a note written in his handwriting. "You forced my hand. Don't say I didn't warn you." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it beside Richard's letters. The three of them together formed a kind of accidental trilogy. One man's guilt, another's greed, and my awakening. I realized then that fear had finally left me. The only thing that remained was clarity, the kind that doesn't seek justice for approval, but for release. That weekend, the newspapers began to call. Daria had filed the civil suit, and word had spread among local reporters who specialized in cases of elder financial abuse. One of them, a woman with a calm, deliberate voice, asked if I would speak on record. At first I refused. I didn't want pity, didn't want to become a headline framed by age and tragedy. But later that night, I thought of all the women like me who would never speak because they had been taught that silence was dignity. The next morning I called back and said yes. The interview took place in my living room. She asked gentle questions, never interrupting when my voice faltered. When she left, she thanked me and said, "People will listen to you. They just need someone to start the story." The article came out a week later, titled, "The Price of Trust." My name was printed beneath a photograph taken near the window, the light catching the silver in my hair. The piece was measured, factual, but beneath its restraint was the echo of something larger, a warning, a reckoning. The day it was published, my phone rang endlessly. Old friends, distant relatives, strangers offering condolences or admiration. I ignored most of them, but late that evening, a new number appeared on the screen. When I answered, there was silence, then a breath, then Peter's voice, quiet and almost unfamiliar. "You made me a villain," he said. "You made me small." I felt an unexpected ache, not pity, but recognition. "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. I just turned on the light." After he hung up, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker against the rain. The world outside seemed unchanged, cars passing, neighbors walking dogs, but something inside me had settled. The escalation was over, at least the visible part. What remained now was endurance, but not the kind I had practiced all my life. This was a new endurance, born not of submission, but of clarity, the kind that allows you to keep breathing, even when the past refuses to apologize, the kind that makes survival feel like an act of defiance. In the weeks that followed, there were hearings, statements, long days spent in offices filled with files and fluorescent light. I moved through it all with a strange calm, like a woman watching her old life burn from a safe distance. There were moments when fatigue threatened to break me, when Peter's lawyer raised his voice, when the bank hesitated to release certain documents. But each time I thought of Richard's handwriting, his final attempt at truth, and I found strength in the wreckage he had left behind. By the time the case reached its turning point, I no longer recognized the woman who had first walked into the bank months ago. That woman had been cautious, almost invisible. I had become something else entirely, not fearless, but unwilling to disappear again. When the court finally acknowledged the validity of my claim, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like balance restored, like gravity returning to its rightful place. The money would be recovered in part, but the real restoration was something quieter, older, and far more profound. I stood outside the courthouse under a pale sky, holding the folder that had started it all, and realized that I no longer needed it. The proof had done its work. What remained was mine to rebuild, slow and deliberate, without permission. I turned toward the wind, letting it lift my hair, and thought, not of revenge, not of loss, but of continuation. Because some stories, once opened, can never be closed again, and maybe that is their true justice. The morning of the final hearing arrived without ceremony. The world outside my window was the same gray it had been for weeks, the kind of color that dulls every outline and flattens even the bravest intentions. I woke early, not from nerves, but from the strange discipline that had entered my body these past months, the rhythm of someone who has learned to live without waiting for permission. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the cup, watching the faint steam dissolve into the air. There was nothing left to prepare. The evidence had been submitted, the witnesses interviewed, the questions rehearsed. All that remained was to stand in a room full of strangers and tell the truth as if it were something tangible, something you could hold up to the light and say, "Here, this is what was done to me." I dressed carefully, choosing a dark green dress that had belonged to my sister years ago. It no longer fit perfectly, but I liked the way it reminded me of the women I came from, those who had endured quietly but never completely surrendered. The courthouse smelled of rain-soaked coats and disinfectant, an odd mixture of bureaucracy and weather. Daria met me at the entrance, her hair damp from the drizzle, her eyes steady. "It's just procedure now," she said, and I nodded, though I knew that nothing about it was just anything. The waiting room was crowded with people clutching folders and briefcases, the collective hum of anxiety and fatigue filling the air. When my name was called, I followed her into the hearing chamber, a sterile space with beige walls and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. At the far end sat the judge, a woman younger than I expected, her expression measured and unreadable. To her right, the bank's representative. To her left, Peter and his lawyer. Seeing him again in that setting, the same suit, the same controlled expression, was like looking at a portrait of a stranger who had once lived inside my house. His eyes flicked toward me for only a moment, a glance that carried neither remorse nor defiance, only calculation. When it was my turn to speak, Daria placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. I stood, the folder of documents trembling slightly in my grasp, and faced the judge. My voice, when it came, was steadier than I expected. I spoke of the letters, of the deposit box, of the gradual disappearance of everything I had built. I described the years of silence that had preceded the discovery, the quiet corrosion that eats away at trust long before the numbers vanish. The judge listened, occasionally making notes. Peter's lawyer objected once, claiming irrelevance, but was overruled. I noticed the faint tightening of Peter's jaw when I read aloud Richard's confession, the line where he admitted to letting our son persuade him, to letting shame outweigh decency. That sentence hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time, Peter looked away. When my testimony was finished, Daria presented the documentation, each piece of paper a fragment of the truth restored to daylight. The bank manager's note, the account transfers, the emails confirming authorization, all lined up in quiet precision, the cold bureaucracy of betrayal. I watched the judge's expression shift subtly, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. When Peter was asked to respond, his voice was calm, practiced, almost gentle. He spoke of misunderstandings, of administrative confusion, of intentions lost in translation. "I never meant to harm her," he said, gesturing toward me with a carefully measured sincerity. "I was only trying to help my parents manage their finances responsibly. My mother has been under a lot of stress since my father passed." The words fell perfectly, like stones arranged to build a wall. For a moment, I saw how convincing he could be, how easy it had been all these years to believe in his composure. But when the judge asked a simple question, why the funds had been transferred to his personal account and not to a joint family account, his explanation faltered. He spoke of temporary adjustments and tax strategies, but the phrases rang hollow. Daria stood then, her voice low but unyielding. "Temporary," she repeated. "For 3 years? Without notice? Without consent?" He tried to answer, but she pressed on, each question a small incision exposing the truth beneath his polished surface. The room felt smaller with every word, the air thick with something unspoken. And then, unexpectedly, I felt not anger, but something quieter, heavier, grief. Grief for the boy he had once been, for the man he could have become, for the years I had spent believing love was enough to protect us from our worst selves. When the session ended, the judge said she would issue her decision within a week. We stood, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoing like distant thunder. Peter gathered his papers without looking at me. For a moment, I thought he might speak, might say something human beneath the layers of defense, but he only adjusted his tie and walked past me toward the door, the faint scent of his cologne lingering like a ghost of former intimacy. Daria touched my arm gently. "You did well," she said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what well meant anymore. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and shining. I walked slowly toward the courthouse steps, each breath a small victory. The sky was breaking open in streaks of pale blue, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone. Daria offered to call me a cab, but I declined. "I want to walk," I said. My shoes soaked through almost immediately, but I didn't care. There was something liberating in the discomfort, in feeling the earth press back against me. The city moved around me, people hurrying, cars splashing through puddles, but I felt suspended in a moment that didn't belong entirely to time. That evening, I returned home and sat by the window in the same chair where I had read Richard's letter months ago. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock, a sound that no longer felt oppressive, but steady, faithful. I opened my notebook and began to write. Not for evidence this time, but for myself. I wrote about the hearing, about Peter's eyes, about the strange calm that had settled inside me as the truth unfolded in public. I wrote about how fear transforms into something almost luminous when it's finally named. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if my hands had been waiting their whole life for this permission. As night deepened, I lit a single candle on the table, its flame reflecting softly against the window pane. The folder of documents still lay open beside me. I reached for the letter from Richard, the one that had started everything, and read it once more. The paper was worn now, the creases softened by handling, but the ink remained sharp. If you ever want to know where it went, go to the Oakside branch. It struck me how those words, once an invitation to pain, had become the map of my resurrection. Without intending to, he had given me back the only thing that truly mattered, my agency. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then, almost instinctively, I took a match and lit the corner. The flame caught quickly, curling the paper inward, the handwriting dissolving into ash. I watched until nothing remained but a small black crescent, then crushed it gently into the ashtray. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply release. The fire's warmth lingered on my fingers, and I thought of how strange it was that destruction could feel so clean. The next morning I gathered the remaining papers, copies, statements, the legal documents that had once defined my battle, and placed them in a large envelope. I labeled it with my name, my full name, written in large, deliberate letters, and stored it in the safe. Not for protection, but for legacy. Let whoever finds it someday know that I existed not as a victim, but as a witness, a woman who refused to vanish quietly. When the official decision arrived a week later, it was delivered in a plain white envelope with the courthouse seal. I read it standing in the doorway, the light from the window falling across the page. The ruling was in my favor: restitution, acknowledgement of misconduct, formal closure. The language was impersonal, almost antiseptic, but beneath it pulsed something human, a recognition that truth, however delayed, had prevailed. I folded the letter, placed it on the table, and sat down slowly. I expected to feel triumph, perhaps even joy, but what I felt instead was an immense, tender exhaustion, the kind that comes not after victory, but after deliverance. I walked to the park that afternoon, the same one where I had first opened Richard's letter. The trees were beginning to turn, the leaves trembling between green and gold. I sat on the familiar bench, the one facing the fountain, and closed my eyes. The air smelled of water and soil, of beginnings. Around me, children's laughter rose and fell like a tide, and somewhere a dog barked, impatient for attention. For the first time in what felt like decades, I allowed myself to be still without defense. I thought of Richard, of Peter, of the long chain of choices that had brought me here, not as tragedies, but as proofs of survival. Every betrayal, every silence, every small act of endurance had carried me to this quiet clarity. When I opened my eyes, the sky had deepened to amber. I watched the last light ripple across the surface of the fountain and felt something close to peace, though not the simple peace of forgetting. It was the peace of acceptance, of understanding that justice is rarely loud or dramatic. It is quiet, measured, and deeply personal. I rose slowly, my knees stiff but steady, and began the walk home. Each step felt deliberate, grounded. Behind me, the wind stirred the fallen leaves into a small whirl, and I thought of how even the gentlest motion can leave a mark. By the time I reached the gate, dusk had settled fully, and the first star flickered faintly in the sky. I looked up, smiled to no one in particular, and whispered, "It's done." The words lingered in the air like a benediction. I moved from that house 3 months after the ruling, though no one asked me to. The rooms had become too full of echoes, too saturated with the weight of everything that had been revealed. I sold most of the furniture, keeping only what I could carry in one small van, and found a modest apartment near the sea, a narrow building with peeling paint and balconies that leaned slightly toward the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that word had begun to feel sacred again. The first night there, I slept with the windows open and listened to the waves hitting the rocks below, steady and indifferent, like a language older than forgiveness. The sound folded around me, neither comforting nor cruel, simply honest. When I woke at dawn, the room was full of pale light and salt, and I realized that I hadn't dreamed of him, neither of Richard nor of Peter. My sleep had been empty, clean, the kind of rest that comes when the past no longer has claws. The days found their rhythm easily. I walked to the small bookstore on the corner, where I'd once wandered as a tourist years ago. It smelled of dust and paper and patience. The owner, a woman with soft eyes and hands ink-stained from unpacking boxes, told me they hosted weekly readings for local writers and poets. I laughed when she invited me, thinking she was mistaking me for someone more interesting, but she insisted, saying, "We like people who listen more than people who talk." So I went. The first evening, I sat in the back, wrapped in my coat, listening to voices read about loss, about beginnings that came disguised as endings. Their words reached me not as poetry, but as recognition. I became a regular presence there. Not quite a friend yet, not a stranger either. The old woman who listened carefully and smiled without intrusion. Sometimes they asked about my past, and I would say, "I used to live inland, in a house that no longer belongs to me." That was enough. I began to write small pieces for the readings, nothing grand, just fragments of memory shaped into sentences. At first my hands trembled too much, but soon the words came more easily. I wrote about the smell of iron in old banks, about the sound of paper tearing, about the strange tenderness that follows after rage. When I finally read one aloud, my voice steady and low, the room fell silent in that collective, fragile way that means people are listening. It wasn't applause that mattered. It was the quiet afterward, the shared understanding that stories, when spoken honestly, have their own gravity. Someone asked me afterward if it was true, and I smiled. "All stories are true," I said. "Some just take longer to prove." I heard from Peter only once after the verdict, a short letter typed, unsigned except for his initials. It said he was moving abroad for work, that he hoped one day we could speak without bitterness. There was no apology, not even an attempt at pretense. I read it twice and then placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't hate him. I had carried hate long enough to understand that it changes nothing, that it feeds on the very space where peace should grow. What I felt for him now was something quieter, more like distance. He had been my greatest wound, and without knowing it, my reluctant teacher. Because of him, I had learned that love without boundaries is only an invitation to erasure, and that forgiveness is not surrender, but the decision to stop letting pain speak for you. As summer approached, the town grew softer. Children ran along the promenade. Seagulls circled lazily, and the air filled with the smell of salt and fried bread. I began taking photographs again with an old camera Richard had given me decades earlier. The film advance stuck sometimes, the lens clouded, but I liked its imperfections. I would photograph the same view of the water each morning, capturing how the light shifted across the surface, how the tide changed color without warning. It became a small ritual, a way of measuring time without counting loss. One afternoon, I developed a role and found that in one of the pictures, a young girl had wandered into the frame, laughing, her arms outstretched toward the sea. She reminded me of a version of myself I had almost forgotten, the one who once believed that the world was wide enough for trust. I pinned that photo to the wall beside my bed. Sometimes when the evenings stretched long and quiet, I would walk down to the beach and sit on the stones, the tide reaching toward my feet. I would think of the women I had met at the Legal Aid Center, of Daria with her tired eyes, of Margaret at the library, of all the stories that began with silence and ended with a name reclaimed. We were all, in our own ways, fugitives from invisibility. I wrote letters to some of them, small notes of gratitude that I never sent, because gratitude is a private thing. It doesn't always require witnesses. The town's post office clerk began greeting me by name, and once, when I came in to buy stamps, he said, "You look lighter these days." I wanted to tell him that he was right, that I had finally set something down that had been breaking my spine for years, but I only smiled and said, "Maybe it's the sea air." There are still mornings when the old ache returns, not as pain, but as memory, like a scar that itches in the rain. On those days, I brew coffee stronger than I should and sit by the window until the light shifts, reminding myself that healing is not a single event, but a slow rearranging of breath. I think of Richard sometimes, of how he tried in the end to make amends, and I wonder if, in whatever place he rests, he knows that I did what he couldn't. I hope he understands that I don't despise him, that his weakness no longer binds me. His letter may have broken my illusion, but it also freed me from the long shadow of dependence. Now when I look at my reflection, I see no trace of the woman who once stood trembling at a bank counter, afraid of paper and consequence. I see someone who has walked through the fire of knowledge and come out scorched, but whole. I have learned that justice is rarely the gift of institutions. It is something you claim quietly, in the privacy of your own conscience. It is the simple act of saying, "This happened and I survived it." I no longer need to prove anything to anyone, least of all to those who built their comfort on my silence. Some evenings, after the bookstore closes, a few of us linger by the pier, watching the horizon fade into dusk. The owner always brings a small bottle of wine, and we drink slowly, the conversation gentle, unhurried. Once a young woman asked me, "Do you believe people can change?" I thought for a moment before answering. "They can," I said, "but sometimes the change is only in the one who stops waiting for them to." She smiled, perhaps not understanding yet, but one day she will. When I return home on those nights, the apartment feels neither empty nor full, just balanced, as if it finally belongs to the present. I light a candle, open the window, and let the sea breeze move through the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn sounds, long and low, a reminder that everything continues. I sit at my small desk and write a few lines in my notebook, not diary entries, but quiet affirmations, fragments of understanding. One of them reads, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without fear." Another says, "Freedom begins when you stop explaining your pain to those who caused it." These are not lessons. They are reminders, anchors I leave for the woman I will still be when memory begins to fade. Before I go to bed, I often whisper into the darkness a small prayer, not to God, not even to the dead, but to the woman I used to be. I tell her she did well, that her endurance was not wasted, that her silence has been transformed into something stronger than shame. The waves answer faintly through the open window, their rhythm endless and forgiving. and I fall asleep knowing that I am no longer waiting for anyone to hand me peace. I have already made it with my own 2 hands.